Welcome to the Histories of Northamptonshire podcast series, and this episode number 29. Recorded on location, each episode tells the story of one of the many and varied objects which are the focus of the exhibition A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects. The exhibition runs at the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery between the 20th of September 2025 and February 2026. Selected by local individuals, heritage groups and the museum's own curators, each object tells a different story from the county's past. And so, to our guest for this episode.
So my name is Rachel Cubitt and I work for Historic England. I'm part of their archaeological excavation team, which itself is part of the National Specialist Services. We have a national remit looking at providing advice for archaeology across England.
What is the object we're talking about now, Rachel?
So this is a Spindle Whorl, and it was found on the Stanwick excavations. It ran from 84, I think, until 92. It was a rescue excavation, essentially, that took place before quarrying in the area which is now known as Stanwick Lakes.
Which is, of course, something that is going on a great deal at the moment with the expansion of housing and development sites. So your work is paramount when it comes to documenting and telling the stories of the past. What is a Spindle Whorl?
It's used with a spindle to turn raw wool fibres into a yarn, which can be used for weaving or knitting. But it looks a little bit like a donut. I think that's the best way to describe it. In technical terms, we'd say it's cylindrical in form, so a circle with a hole through it. Ours is made of chalk, so a type of limestone, and it would originally have had a wooden stake through the hole in the middle. The way that it's used is that somebody has a bunch of raw wool fibres, and they tease one end of those out and wrap it around the base of the spindle, which is then dropped and spun with the fingers. And as it spins and more wool fibres are teased out, they get the twist which we're used to seeing on thread. And as the spindle drops down towards the floor, the yarn which is being created wraps around the wooden spindle, and then the process is repeated.
This particular Spindle Whorl, it's unique because it's got someone's name on it, I believe.
It has, yes. Spindle whorls are very common finds on Roman sites. We find them in big quantities on most Roman sites. Spinning would have been a daily task for women in the Roman period. Yarn was needed for lots of different clothing items, obviously. It's before man-made fibres are available. So it was a big job to turn all of this raw wool into usable yarn. But this one, as you say, is particularly interesting because it has an inscription on it, which is very rare. There are just 3 spindle whorls in Roman Britain that have an inscription, something that an expert would refer to as a graffito. So graffiti, the plural, this is a singular graffito. And essentially a Roman woman who owned this spindle whorl sometime in the Roman period has inscribed her name on it. Looking at the surface, it just looks like a series of scratches, I have to say. But there is an expert on Roman writing, a man called Dr. Roger Tomlin, who's at Wolfson College at Oxford, and he has kindly read it for us. He's determined that it's a spindle whorl that belongs to Julia, or Iulia in the Latin. Although we only have half of it, we have enough to see the end of her surname and the beginning of the first name, Iulia. And we know that it's a mark of possession because the inscription ends in an E, which shows it's possessive, in the same way that we would say Rachel's and add the apostrophe S.
So this is literally a piece of graffiti saying, this is Julia's.
Yes, and I think that's one of the really lovely things because it's so relatable. We all have prized possessions or things that it would be very inconvenient if they were lost or misplaced. And it's very common. Everybody from school age up has something with their name on it.
Spindle whorls are obviously tools of someone's craft or of their trade. Would this have been a prized possession of Julia?
We assume so because she has inscribed her name into it. As I say, they are common finds and they're made from all sorts of different materials. We get jet ones, which we think were particularly prized, but we also get whorls which are made of pottery sherds. If you've broken your ceramic vessel, you can take one of the fragments of that, make a hole through the middle and use it as a spindle whorl. One of the really interesting questions is why this was particularly dear to her and why she wanted to inscribe it such that people knew that it was hers.
Does it give us any kind of an indication as to what community she came from, if something which is so functional is so dear to her?
The really interesting thing actually is in terms of the name itself. We have Julia, obviously, and then her surname, we think, is a Celtic surname. That's Roger's reading of it. His interpretation is that although this lady is a Roman citizen, her family is still using a Celtic family name. And that's really interesting because it shows something about their identity in terms of how they want to present themselves.
Is that an echo of invasion in that case?
Difficult to know whether they are a local family that have British origins, essentially, and then have sort of assimilated to a certain extent to Roman culture. Don't know. What we do know is that it was found at the Stanwick Villa. So the Stanwick Villa site was really at its zenith in the 4th century. It developed from less fancy origins, essentially. There's a whole prehistoric landscape around us in the Stanwick Ruins area, trackways and field systems that were set out in the 1st century, buildings that developed through the 2nd and 3rd and then became more elaborate. And so we have this villa building, sort of the upper echelons of society, bathing suites, mosaics, all of the classic Roman material culture. So we know that Julia is involved somehow in that community. It's not just the elite family that are residing at the villa. They would have had a whole cast of characters alongside them, visitors, craftspeople who would come to lay the mosaics, people that were working on the estate. Sheep were part of the economic package that we know that they were grazing. So there is wool to be processed. Unfortunately, we don't know where Julia fits within that population. The whorl was found in a lair that had been disturbed. Quite often on archaeological sites that have a whole depth of activity, earlier material will be disturbed and misplaced and turned over. So we don't know when in the Roman period it is from. But yeah, lots of really interesting questions about who she was and what she was doing there.
You say we don't know her position within that community, but clearly she had skills because she was making yarn. Is it likely that she would also have been a knitter of wool, a creator of garments?
Potentially. I don't know that the Romans don't knit quite like we do, but they weave. So possibly that sort of thing is a specialised task, but it's a sort of thing which a group of tasks that are carried out together if you're doing textile processing, perhaps.
So would this have been a piece of industry, or would have this been more of a pastime for Julia?
I think an industry, probably. As I said, spinning was a daily task for women because there was so much wool to be converted into this yarn, which people needed for all of their sort of textiles, all of their garments, and then other textiles that were being used in the villa complex. There's a theory that some of the elite women who were spinning and using the jet spindle whorls might have been a bit more of a performative thing because obviously they didn't need to do that. There was somebody to produce those things for them. It's possible that for Julia it was more of a necessary task rather than a pastime.
So a trade.
When you say trade, you start to think about people being remunerated for their work, but we don't really know how that worked, I think. It may have just been that that was the thing that she performed within that society and somebody else was the one that gathered the food. You know, everybody had their own role and it sort of all worked together.
I would love to know how old Julia was from this. I just wonder if this is the markings of a young girl or maybe an adolescent young woman making her way within society. We can't tell that from this fragment of the Spindle Whorl, or can we?
No, unfortunately, we don't know. Beyond the name, there's very little that we can say about her. As you say, it would be very interesting to know whether perhaps this was her first Spindle Whorl and that was why she was so keen to mark it as her own. One of the interesting questions as well is whether she made the inscription herself, whether she could read and write, or whether it was somebody else who did that for her. Determining levels of literacy is quite difficult. We know that there is literacy, particularly at villa sites. Some of the very fancy mosaics that you get at villas are actually based on written stories and plays, Greek epics and so on. And we find a lot of stylus, writing equipment. If you imagine an estate has a lot of administration, all of the taxes, all of the products that are going out and being bought in to support the people living there, there's a lot of record keeping that's needed. But determining the literacy of the sort of general population and of those within the villa estate who are not doing the administration and are not the elite.
So in summary then, we're talking about an object which somebody would have used in a crafting kind of a way, perhaps a tool of trade, perhaps a pastime. Somebody with perhaps Celtic origins who was a Roman citizen fitting somewhere into the community at Stanwick Lakes. Somebody who held a particular interest in this particular object because she marked her name on it, or somebody marked her name on it. It's evidential of the working of wool to create a yarn. But there are still lots of questions which remain unanswered. What is your reaction to the object itself, given everything that you've told me, Rachel?
I think it's a really fascinating thing. I think, obviously, as an archaeologist, I'm very used to handling things which are nearly 2,000 years old, but this is one that really stands out. It's quite rare to be able to connect an individual find to a specific person, a named person. We get quite used to talking about Roman populations and even site populations more generically, but here we have an actual individual from Roman Northamptonshire, and I think that's really exciting.
And what do you think that individual and her object, all these centuries later, what do you think that says about Northamptonshire? Why should this item be part of the 100 items exhibition?
I think it shows the richness of the material remains that we have in Northamptonshire. As you've said, we're sitting on top of a Roman site. This object is from a Roman site not far from here. There's a real quality of archaeology and quantity of archaeology in this area. So it's fitting perhaps that something so interesting and so unusual within Roman Britain should come from here. I think it helps remind the modern visitor to the exhibition that all of these things in the cases, as well as being interesting in their own right, do stand for individuals, that they were people's possessions. People owned them, cared for them. In Julia's case, the Spindle Whorl has been lost at some point. It's been broken. We don't know that side of the story either, but it really reminds us that these are people's things. We all have things that we hold on to. I think it really makes it very personal.
It's a fascinating insight into something which is an inanimate object, but perhaps which does tell quite the story, as you say, of an individual. Rachel, fascinating to hear from you. Thank you so much for telling me the story.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this Histories of Northamptonshire podcast. If you would like to find out more about the objects or listen to other episodes in the series, go to www.northamptonmuseums.com. Alternatively, you can visit the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery, where you can see the A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects exhibition for yourself. The Histories of Northamptonshire project is funded by Arts Council England as part of the National Portfolio Programme.